Embedding the voice of nature in governance structures and beyond. This is Lizzie Wood from the Green Party of Florida with Lawyers for Nature in the UK, who will be on shortly. Okay. All right, we need to advance these slides, Sam, or I'll just do it here. Okay, great. All right, so the Green Party has added rights of nature provisions in our national platform, and rights of nature stems from indigenous knowledge. It is the recognition and honoring that nature has rights to exist, persist, maintain and regenerate its vital systems, and we have responsibility to ensure those rights. Next. So here's the Green Party US platform to date. We support the adoption of local, state, and federal laws which recognize the legal rights of natural communities and ecosystems, including wetlands, streams, rivers, aquifers, and other water systems, to exist, flourish, regenerate, naturally evolve, and be restored. We support the inclusion in those laws of the ability of people and communities to file legal actions in the name of the affected natural community or ecosystem, and for the courts to require restoration of the natural community or ecosystem back to its pre-damaged state. Next. So what we're going to be hearing about today also is this myth of separation, which I think most of the Greens know that we are all interconnected with all the species of life on planet Earth, Mother Earth, and not separate. Okay, so our lives depend upon the biodiversity of our systems. Okay, so as we know, words have been changing their meanings by certain individuals and groups lately, and that has not just been lately, that has occurred throughout history. And so one word that was changed is nature. Now, in the distant past, nature was seen as an entity and living being, and the Oxford Dictionary changed the definition of nature. And so Lawyers for Nature and these wonderful groups in the UK over there decided to try to get the dictionary to fix the definition of nature. Okay, and so we're actually doing that here in the US too, but they were able to be successful. And we know that when we use words that they actually have, you know, real ramifications in our lives. So it was an excellent campaign, the We Are Nature campaign. Okay, words can change the world. Next. So why do we need the voice of nature? And here's a quote from Lawyers for Nature, part of the reason I love them so much. Having nature represented in decision-making structures is a response to multiple interconnected crises facing society, including biodiversity loss, climate change, and systemic governance failures. Traditional decision-making structures are no longer sufficient. I don't know if they were. And new approaches are needed to govern our relationship with the natural world. Okay, so this is what it's about. We have been doing a lot of campaigns for rights of nature. In Florida, in the 2020 election, we had 89.6% of the vote in Orange County for rights of nature, for clean water. Okay, that's across the board. That's not just Greens, that's people of all stripes, practically 90%. Our state legislature then decided to enact like a retroactive preemptive bill to prevent this. And so, you know, we're having some issues. This is not just happening in Florida, but elsewhere as well. This new novel rights of nature approach is something that we can do, not only in our state parties, not only our candidates, not only in their public service, but in our organizations and businesses as well. So we can create system change by changing the structures that we're participating in. And it's really an important thing, because those of us who know can put it into action. Those who don't will start understanding, oh, their worldview needs to be expanded. They start having that change, the change that we need. So this is great. Next. Okay, so the Green Party of Florida is the first political party in the United States to embed the voice of nature in its structure by adopting a nature director. Okay, and we want to show you how. Okay, Lawyers for Nature helped us, and we're just in the beginning stages, and we want to help each other. So we want to have a collective. We want everyone to help each other on this journey, answer each other's questions and what works for you and what might work for us. And in this way, we can really create the change we need. Okay. Now, of course, I'm the new nature director. I am not qualified to speak for nature. Okay. I'm a human being. Okay. I have anthropocentric thinking, right? But we do our best. We will consult with indigenous knowledge keepers, with land connected peoples, with really peer reviewed, wonderful science, local and global, that help us in this journey. Okay, so we're going to gather this information and have that individual, a nature guardian, a nature director, nature council member, committee member, whatever your structure is, and bring that into the room where decisions are being made. And sociologically, that just changes the dynamic, right? Because nature's not been in the room where decisions are being made. So that's what's happening. You see the QR code there, and you can link to the page where you can fill out, I'm interested, or I've already begun this journey. And that'll put you on the list, and we'll be working together. Okay, thanks. Next. So again, embedding the voice of nature can happen in your candidate platform and public service. And on that link from the QR code, you can do a candidate pledge, and we'll be promoting candidates that do the pledge. You can do it in your local Green Party, state and national. And again, in your nonprofits and businesses, something that you're doing every day. Okay. Nature-related matters should have nature in the room. I mean, we're in this room here. We all are focused on the human beings, but the air we breathe, the nature all around us is a part of us being here. Okay. Next. So Greens know people in harmony with planet is peace. Okay. And here's a quote from one of my heroes, Cormac Cullinan. It's about remembering that we are participants in a larger community of life. Okay. We are responsible for our role in the community of life. Okay. We don't just keep taking, but have a reciprocal relationship. Next. All right. So again, we just talked about living nature, and here you see a nice landscape, and you notice this water body. It's a river. Water is an amazing living being. This river, is it alive? What's it doing? This soft water is flowing and flowing and changing the landscape. So if we think about ourselves for a moment, take a breath and realize that each of us are water bodies, right? We're mostly water. All right. So together, we can be this river of change. We can cut through all of this nonsense that does not serve us anymore and, create the change we need. So we're a river. We're starting this journey together. And now I'm going to introduce Lawyers for Nature. Okay. Next. So Lawyers for Nature has been doing excellent work regarding rights of nature, and earth jurisprudence. They've also created this novel rights of nature approach about embedding nature into governance structures. And I'm very thrilled that Bronte, Jesse, and Paul, extraordinary people, are here with us today to help teach us a little bit more about this and show us the way. Go ahead. I apologize that my notes were lost in this tech issue today. So I would have had a better intro. So please feel free also to introduce yourselves, Lawyers for Nature.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And sadly, we couldn't be in Chicago as we live over in the UK. So I'm Bronte. I'm the managing director of Lawyers for Nature. Lawyers for Nature is a collective of solicitors, barristers, and academics who see nature as our client. And we attempt to create law, manipulate law, use law in such a way that would protect nature. I'll let my colleague Paul introduce himself next, and then I'll come back.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the co-director and founder of Lawyers for Nature with Bronte and Jesse. And as well as being a barrister and a campaigner for the rights of nature, I'm the guardian of a river in East London, where I look after the river and then use my experiences, good and bad, of doing that to try and shape activism and law in the benefit of both my river and rivers around the country.
Thanks, Paul. And I should just say we're three directors. So our colleague Jessie, it's her first day of her holiday today, and we don't get much time off at Lawyers for Nature. So we decided that Paul and I could handle this. But obviously Jessie is very much a part of the team. And in fact, Jessie was the main lawyer in charge of the We Are Nature campaign. So the change in the dictionary definition of nature is largely down to Jessie. Today, we're here to do these four things with you. So Lizzie's asked us to talk you through the ideas behind nature on the board in terms of the philosophy. We're going to have a quick look at two case studies that we've worked with. And then Paul's going to talk a bit more about what it actually means to speak for nature and how it changes things. And then we'll open the floor for a Q&A. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm just going to start with this quote from the very wonderful Rebecca Solnit. And I often open my speeches with this quote because I think it really helps us to understand what is needed. A crisis is a crisis of storytelling. And I think there's just so much simplicity in that, but it also conveys everything that's going on. We are in a huge, tumultuous period of change, and we have to find a way to start telling a new story because whatever we're doing right now isn't working. And so, nature on the board, nature guardianship, nature representation, it is an attempt to start telling a new story. It's an attempt to do law differently. And of course, all law starts with a story. So, law doesn't just come into effect. Law starts way, way, way before the legislator. And it starts with a shared understanding of story, of morals, of ethics, and then eventually pops out the other end as a piece of law. So I really can't stress it enough that being a storyteller is probably one of the most important things we can do in a time of crisis. So what's our story? Well, Paul and myself never, ever describe ourselves as environmental lawyers. In fact, neither of us have ever studied environmental law. My master's was in rights and responsibilities, and Paul is, in fact, a qualified barrister working in housing and employment, amongst other things, mainly the civil bar. I'm a corporate lawyer. And so we don't subscribe to the idea that environmental law is adequate enough to protect nature. What we see with environmental law is that it's a story about permitting. It's a story about the amount of harm that humans can do that is permissible within a certain system. It's a story about protecting some humans from other humans' harm, but it's never a story about nature in and of itself. It's never a story that says nature has an intrinsic right to exist. It's never a story about the other species that live in the world. It's always a story about some mostly wealthy humans who are asking for permission to cause harm. So we don't subscribe to the idea that environmental law will save us. And in fact, we think that we need a new discipline of law called nature law. So, what might this look like? Well, first of all, as I've already alluded to, we do need to start telling that story of what nature law might look like. And our position is that nature should have representation in every legal system. Nature should have guardians that advocate for it. Nature should have rights. It should have legal personhood. And we should build a new morality and a new set of ethics based on those ideas, based on the idea that nature is not a resource for us to take from. Nature is not something that can just simply be used up and indefinitely replenished. And we think that that should feed into our politics, hence why we're here talking to you today. And eventually we see that there should be law made that gives nature rights. So environmental law does not protect nature. Environmental law protects humans who seek to do activities within nature that create harm. And it is a permissible structure of permitting and harm, essentially. It generally permits nature to be used as an object. And I think that's something I just want to pause on for a second. The position we have at Lawyers for Nature is that nature should be a subject of law. And when you're a subject of law, you cannot have discussions about mining, burning, cutting down, draining, damming, and polluting huge areas of nature, because nature is seen as a subject. And what we mean by that is that just like a citizen of a legal system, nature would have the right to come to court and to say, I don't want this to happen, or this shouldn't happen in this way. Nature would have the right to come to court and claim a set of fundamental rights, such as the right to exist, the right to life. It may have some secondary rights as well. So we have those as humans, and it may have some procedural rights. But all the time it's considered as an object by environmental law, then these things can happen without nature having any representation and without nature being able to speak its corner. So our position is, what if nature were a legal person with rights? How would this feel in legal systems? How would it feel to give nature power, influence, and agency? And we've done this before. So we've got a very checkered history as a group of humans of exclusion. So all through human civilization and human history, we see battles where some humans are fighting for representation against other humans who hold all the power and influence. And just very briefly, the lady that's on your screen right now is Letty Pate Whitehead. And Letty Pate Whitehead was the very first woman to be appointed to a listed corporation. And it was actually fairly accidental. In essence, her husband had died, and part of the takeover bid by this company, and if you haven't already guessed, the company is, of course, Coca-Cola in its very early days. Part of the process of Coca-Cola taking over her husband's company was to give a member of that company a seat on the board. And when her husband died, she was in fact able to take that position. Now, we don't really know much about her. There is still a foundation in her name. But interestingly for us, we don't really know what she did day to day. We know that she sat on that board for 20 years. She attended all the board meetings that she was allowed to and ready to attend. She spoke at those board meetings. She guided decisions, and she represented hope, essentially, for women who were coming into a political space without any power, without any influence, and without any representation. So I'm not here to sit here and say to you today that having nature on the board will fundamentally alter the pillars of our society. It probably won't, but it is a really good start. And just like Letty Pate Whitehead, somebody has to go first. Somebody has to sit on that board and represent nature, just like she did when she sat on Coca-Cola's board all those years ago. And I think that the other thing to say is that just because we don't know what she did, just because there's no big showdown, like a TV program where somebody comes flying in with a piece of paper and says, stop proceedings, it doesn't mean that it didn't make a difference. And I think that's the thing with this area of work, is you have to accept that having nature on your board gently changes the direction of the ship over a number of years. So it is a mindset shift. And just like if the Titanic had been able to steer 1 degree away from the iceberg 3 or 4 hours beforehand, it would have missed it entirely. And that's what we're trying to do with Nature on the Board. We're trying to take a very, very long view, 10, 15, 30, or even 50, or even 100 years, of just changing things by 1 degree, just having representation in the room, just asking for nature to be represented for in and of itself, away from human interests. So, what would happen then if business, politics, the third sector, charities, the public sector gave nature space, gave nature agency, power, influence? What would happen if nature had a voice and a vote? Well, in 2022, we were asked exactly this by a company called Faith in Nature, who called Paul and I at the time and said, we'd really like to make nature our CEO. Now, the advice we gave them at the time was we felt that that wasn't, in fact, the best way of doing things. Making nature their CEO would have made it quite gimmicky in many ways. And so we asked them to consider having a seat for nature at the table as a non-executive director. Now, Faith in Nature is a reasonably sized company. It turns over about 20 million and employs 100 people. So it wasn't a small project. And we had to spend about 9 months with the company working through what this might look like. And that involved a lot of protocols, a lot of directions, a lot of documentation. We changed their articles of association, which is essentially their constitution. We gave them a new objects clause, which is a directional clause for the directors of the company, asking them to consider being nature positive alongside their responsibilities to steward shareholder capital. And we asked for nature to be able to enter their spaces and vote and discuss and influence decisions about nature, about product sourcing, about energy use, about water use, about recycling. And of course, they're not a government, they're not a huge multinational. So in that sense, it cannot make huge differences. But what it started was a ripple effect, like a pebble in a pond. And that rippled out into loads and loads of other organizations, into places like national parks. So, for example, there is a national park in America who has nature on their board of trustees for the national park. And that representative is entitled to discuss things like pest management, tree management, roots management, fungi management. They're entitled to commission research. They're entitled to speak at meetings about what is best for nature in the national park. It's rippled out to a big public body here in the UK, which is the National Infrastructure Commission of Wales, which is a commission that looks at huge infrastructure projects like motorways and dams, and big land management plans. And it's rippled out to other companies, of course, as well. There has been a bill put forward in the French Parliament to convince the French lawmakers to pass a piece of legislation which would require all companies to allow nature to be represented in their business transactions. And more is happening all the time. So we're currently working with a cohort of charities where we're looking at changing the charitable sector's duties to nature and asking trustees of charities to actually have a duty to nature. And our second case study today was a company that followed Faith in Nature. And we just wanted to mention them because they went one step further and they asked us to draft in the obligation to consider equitable sharing with future generations. And this is something that we've been working on and they continue to work on, which is the idea that we owe an ethical obligation to people that will come after us to ethically share the resources that we have on the planet and use the resources in such a way that we will not deplete the entire planet for future generations, that we safeguard species, for example, that are going extinct because of our behavior. And so this was a sort of an add-on and a bolt-on that we felt was quite useful with House of Hackney. And one way in which they've interpreted it is quite interesting, and one of the reasons I wanted to share it with you. And they've interpreted it in such a way as that they should have a responsibility to safeguard ancient craft. And what I mean by that is when they looked at how things are made, they realized that on average in the West, we lose 100 types of craft a year. So way things are made, things are processed, ancient ways of making things, those kind of methodologies were being lost year on year with nobody to carry them on. And so one of the things they've wanted to do is to try and safeguard some craft for the future so that future generations can understand how you might make something in a very nature positive way, in a very holistic way, in a very regenerative way, in a circular way. And so they are attempting to preserve crafts which relate to their business. And that's just one of the things they're doing. They're doing a huge amount as well beyond that. But they also included future generations. So here's just some of the people that are doing this. As I've said, I've mentioned Faith in Nature, and I've mentioned the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales. Just last month in our national press, SAMS, which is the Scottish Association for Marine Science, who are friends of ours, and we've been helping them a little bit with their journey. They appointed the ocean to their board. So they are a marine science research institution, and they felt that justice and ethics demanded that the ocean have a voice within their research facility, as opposed to it just being anthropocentric, which I think is really, really interesting. And their project to give the ocean a voice is really taking off. So we can share some videos of Helen, who is the new voice of the ocean at SAMS afterwards, if you like. And so we really hope that the Green Party will join these guys and many others that I couldn't fit on the slide as well. And essentially create a situation where we move from rights to responsibilities to remedies. So at the moment, we don't give nature any rights. At best, we simply identify some responsibility for polluters and for people that damage nature. We very rarely grant remedies that go directly back to the harm that's being caused. And even when we do, we don't enforce them to the fullest extent of the law. And so our position is that if we can do this, if we can work to give nature rights, then we would award nature rights, we would identify responsibility to uphold those rights, we would grant remedies, and we would use the full force of that law to enforce those remedies against the wrongdoers. And so we ask you today to think about, what if the Green Party imagined a space for nature and for rights of nature in your decision-making spaces? And I just ask you to think, what would nature say to you? I'm going to hand over to my colleague Paul now. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but Paul will take over and reintroduce what he's going to talk about today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bronte. And yeah, this is slightly contrasting now because Bronte's spoken about many of the government organizations and companies that we've worked with to put nature on the board of, and this is much more grassroots thing of being a nature guardian. And it really contrasts with some of the board appointments we've made, because a lot of those board appointments have been about nature in general, so representing the interests of nature in the decisions of companies like Faith in Nature or House of Hackney. And this is about a different idea of connecting with a specific part of nature, so a specific river, woodland, landscape, or other area of nature, and then becoming a guardian of that place, of that nature, but then crucially representing that nature in decisions that affect it, and using that process and the learnings from that as a form of activism to demand changes on the national policy and legal level. It's quite a lot to wrap up in 10 or 15 minutes, so I'll try my best. So the photo that you can see on the screen in front of you is of me in front of my river. It's the third biggest river in London, and I moved there in 10 years ago. to find a place to live on my boat. Crucially, nobody gave me permission to move there. And indeed, many of the authorities that control the area and control the river would probably rather I weren't there. I think that's a crucial part here, is that we don't need to wait for permission to become nature guardians or to start implementing rights of nature in the world. We can just do it. And how do we do that? Well, for me, with my river, I just began to look around me at the issues and problems with the river. And then decided to start addressing those. So I could see there was lots of rubbish in the river. So I was like, well, I better get that rubbish out. So I began to advertise those online, and more people joined me for voluntary sessions. And we started taking out the rubbish from the river. Crucially, all that time spent with the river over many years doing that task, I started to notice other things that, wait a second, there's sewage coming out of this pipe here. What do we need to do about that? I noticed when I was in the river doing a litter pick when it started raining, and all of the runoff from the roads turned the river black and oily. And so I realized there was another problem that needed sorting. I also started noticing some of the good stuff as well. You can see just in that photo there, it's slightly blurry in the background, but that there is a whole reed bed. And actually, this is in London. This is sandwiched between a motorway and a government housing project. And behind those reed beds is a concrete wall. And I noticed that where there was even a tiny amount of mud or silt in front of the wall, nature came back and renaturalized the river. So I began to start expanding my work as a guardian to, and this is all in my spare time for free, by the way, so there's never a professional appointment, to doing those issues. But crucially, although I was doing with amazing volunteers all this work out on the river, I realized that just doing that alone is not going to solve matters, because ultimately these are systemic issues and many of them require a governmental and regulatory response. I mean, I can and have been planting trees in silt in front of flood defences, but if I'm going to try and restore the river that way, it's going to take me the best part of a lifetime, which I'm happy to do, but I'd also rather the government just come and use its resources and power to do that job in a couple of years so the river can restore itself and renaturalise much quicker. The problem is, of course, is that government agencies are not particularly responsive, and particularly those environmental agencies, because they're based in this old system, this old paradigm that regards nature as a resource. And they say, oh, well, nature's still a resource, but we just need to manage it better for human interest, because in order to better use it, we need to make sure this resource is sustainable. But that still sees nature as a resource, and still means that those environmental agencies are ultimately not acting in the best interests of the river. And I tried meeting with these agencies to try and get them to take a different approach, but it didn't really work because they just ignored me, to be honest. And beginning with sewage, I started actually taking direct action, going out on the river and then finding the illegal sewage outlets, finding out what harm they were doing, and then publicizing that through the media and through activism to try and get the water companies to fix the sewage. And that is actually happening now. But the final thing I want to end on really is the thing that's happened this year, which I think really shows the power of nature guardianship, of entering into a relationship with a specific part of nature and then using that to enact regulatory and legal change through activism. So the version of your Environmental Protection Agency in the UK is called the Environment Agency. Now, I don't know how useless the EPA are. I don't hear great things from the media across the Atlantic about them. Maybe they're better than the Environment Agency, but our government agency, the Environment Agency, is singularly useless at protecting the environment. Across my river, there are dozens of illegal sewage outlets pouring in over 1 billion litres a year just into my river, and the Environment Agency has done nothing about it. There's huge illegal waste dumps of tens of thousands of tonnes where people have dumped beside the river. They've done nothing about it. And they also won't restore the river. And actually, worse than that, they actually get in the way of restoring the river. So they demand that those who want to restore the river, even local volunteers, have to have what's called a flood risk activity permit in order to do their restoration work. And I began to think that this was actually a weakness that they had. And maybe actually there was an action I could do to exploit that weakness. The fact that they are refusing to enforce the law on serious environmental crime. but going after and enforcing the law against ordinary people, volunteers who are just trying their best to restore their river where the government has failed to do so. And so I found this beautiful, well, should be a beautiful tributary of the River Roding called the Aldersbrook, thousands of years old, but has been effectively cut off by flood defences, and over the last 60 years filled with rubbish and sewage. And you can see actually in that photo there with the woman leaning down, that's just some of the rubbish that is caught in that river. And I asked the Environment Agency, could they restore the river? You know, come and take all the rubbish and silt out, stop the sewage, get rid of the invasive species, because this actually could be a really beautiful natural brook. They were like, no, we haven't got any funding for that. And I was like, oh, can I do it then? And they were like, no, you can't do it either because it's too dangerous and you haven't got permission. So I decided to do it anyway. And I got together with dozens of local volunteers, and I hired a digger on my credit card. And then we took hundreds of bags of rubbish out, mopeds, safes, all different guns, knives, you name it. We found it in that river. And we also took out, you know, hundreds of tons of silt as well, and delicately spread it on the banks. And all of the seeds that were in the silt have now grown back and covered it back over. And crucially, we've gone from it being this river effectively lost as a pile of muddy, stinking rubbish into a brook that's now about 2 or 3 foot deep, and fish coming back for the first time, marginal plants coming back. And what was the response of the Environment Agency? Well, it was to threaten to prosecute me for restoring the river without a permit. I then used that against them, not just to try and get off that, because I didn't particularly care. You know, if they want to send me to jail for restoring a river without a permit, I think it would almost be quite funny. But also to highlight their failures and to try and get them to actually act to restore my river. And over the course of a number of weeks, they were absolutely mauled in the press and indeed on social media around the world. And then as a result of that and all that publicity, which interestingly cut across political divides, even right-wing parties and right-wing people in the UK were supporting me, because they're like, this is ridiculous. Of course they should be prosecuting water companies for putting sewage in, not ordinary people for taking rubbish and silt out of a river. It's ridiculous. So they withdrew the threat of prosecution. And more importantly, I managed to get a meeting with one of their most senior managers to put the case on my river and say, we are going to restore this river, whatever you do. So maybe, well, you can choose to do the same thing again and get kicked, you know, have your ass kicked in the media around the world, or you can join in with us and actually turn it into a good news story where you're using your powers and resources to help restore the river. It's still open exactly as to whether they're going to do that. But the point is now is their failures have been highlighted, and the needs of the river have been also highlighted around the world and to that agency. And that's just one story, I think, of activism through guardianship. And I think it's a really powerful technique that nature lovers and Greens around the world can potentially use. Because I do feel that sometimes some of the old methodology of, you know, protest, blocking roads or protesting to try and seek the change we want has its limits. But this, I think, is an interesting new methodology by connecting with a specific place, building that love, which gives you the credibility to act for it, and then restoring it and acting to restore it, regardless of what the government and what the failures, the failing regulatory agencies tell us. I think there's something there, and it's a course of action that I would maybe recommend you do, and to have a think about what parts of nature you can connect with, enter into a relationship of guardianship with, and then act to protect and restore. And then, final step, using the story of what you've done to protect and restore that part of nature to affect regulatory and legal change on a broader regional and national and maybe international level. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So I think that largely concludes our section. And I think Lizzie's asked us to open the floor for questions. So if we can hear you, we're happy to answer any questions, or you could ask Lizzie to relay them or put them in the chat. But we're here for another few minutes and we can answer any questions you have. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Lawyers for Nature. I see hearts coming up. And we do have some questions in the room, and we may have a few online that we will share also.
Hello? Can everyone hear me? Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Andres Ginetti. I'm with the Green Party of New Jersey. I had two questions. Within this paradigm of nature as a subject of law, right? I just want to understand how this would look like on the ground a little bit, right? If how would the remedies look like if you have a suit or something, right? That it having this paradigm of nature as a subject of law, if someone is suing on behalf of nature, right? Because of pollution in a river or like forest fires, right? How would the remedies look like as opposed to the paradigm of violation of human rights, like a violation of environmental rights within environmental law, how those remedies would differ is my question. And the second question I have is within this paradigm of nature as subject of law, what do you think? I know uh, maybe when we deal with law that deals with human beings, it's easier maybe because we're moral agents and whatever, we have feelings, so it's maybe there are things that are a little bit different there. But with what do you think of seeing ourselves as being part of nature? And I'm thinking of like the German romantics that talked about human beings being like, nature couldn't cry, so they made people so people could cry and so on. What do you think of of us as a role and ourselves within nature, right? And within this paradigm, no? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'll hand over to Paul for the first one, and I'll try and do something with the second one.
I was going to hand over to you. Well, on that last one, I think there's something interesting there because we ran the We Are Nature campaign to say that humans and nature are the same thing. However, we do have individual parts of nature do have their own interests that are often either separate from or sometimes against or in opposition to the interests that nature might have. And I feel like you mentioned this kind of romantic idea of humans feeling for nature, but I feel like one of our key purposes as human beings is to be not just stewards of nature, but enrichers of nature and guardians of nature. So not just to be here to not make nature worse, we are here to actively make it richer and more vibrant. And then, by the way, to bask and wonder and enjoy the beauty and richness that we've created, if we want to get poetic about it. And for me, this kind of rights of nature and this guardianship piece really gives us a framework for doing that. So for me, the end goal on my river is to make it as vibrant and rich and diverse and in life and as beautiful as I can. And all of the stuff I do around guardianship and rights of nature is a framework for making that happen. And so I think, yes, adopt that as an overall principle, but then we need to work out the detail of how we actually make that happen. And this for me is the framework for that.
I think I might need you to reissue your question for the first part. There was quite a lot in that. I think in terms of nature representation, I know I'm just going to talk around the subject for a minute. I don't think any one of us would pretend that it's perfect or an exact kind of channeling of what nature thinks or needs. Humans are, first of all, we are quite a particular species. We're the only species with the language that we have, that we know of. And also, we are not exceptional in some ways. We are just mammals. So there's this kind of weird thing with humans where we can speak very eloquently, but also we are just another mammal species on the planet. There's a very kind of there's an arrogance to this in the sense that we are suggesting that we are the best species to speak for nature. And I think that always needs to be tempered. And we always need to get back in touch with our humility and our own kind of sense of being an animal. Having said that, I also don't believe in gatekeeping. So I don't think that nature representation should be done by just one type of human, for example. In fact, I often say that if you can't have a 10-year-old in the room, then you should be changing the room. You shouldn't be changing the 10-year-old. You shouldn't be asking the 10-year-old to go and get an ecology degree, for example. It should be the case that a 10-year-old could walk into the room, listen to what's being discussed, and talk to you as if they were a tree, for example. That could be a thing. We don't need to make this a heavily specialized area. I'm sorry, I'm probably not answering your questions at all. I'm just repurposing them for my own benefit and talking around it. So if anybody else would like to ask any more questions, I'm happy to move on.
Another one?
I'm Steve Bloom from New York. And I was struck by the formulation in the Green Party platform that you put up on the screen about restoring nature to its pre-damaged state. And I'm curious, from a legal point of view, how do you define a pre-damaged state, since everything has been damaged for thousands of years? How far back are we putting the clock with that formulation?
Hi, yeah, I think that's a really great question. I'm happy just to jump in and do a Lawyers for Nature view, and then I think Lizzie might have a view on that as well. I would say that baseline control is one of the most important things we can do. So what you find in law is when you get sort of offsetting or you get restoration work, often the baseline is one of the most important things that can be scrutinized. So if, for example, you're looking at soil health and you set your baseline to 2005, that's a very different baseline to 1925, right? So controlling who's setting the baseline and where they're setting it is one of the most important things we can do. You're absolutely right. It is also the case that it is probably impossible to go back thousands of years and reinstate a river to what it looked like thousands of years ago. So we do have to be realistic. But I think there's a nod in the direction of, hang on a minute, we should be careful what baselines we're setting here. The other thing to say is that there is often not a binary choice. So some places in the world, you'll be able to find absolutely pristine nature, such as the deep forest of Ecuador, for example. And the choice is, do we destroy this, or do we try and, make sure these trees are restored to where they were 1,000 years ago? But in the centre of London or the centre of Chicago, that's not going to be the discussion. The discussion is going to be very, very different. And we do have to respect that nature discussions will be hyper-localised. And so what might be right for the deep forest of Ecuador might not be right for the centre of Chicago. However, we should be starting from a position of do no harm. And in fact, we should be trying to use baselines which do uplift nature back to at least some kind of sensible point. That would be my answer to that. But Lizzie might have something else to say.
Thank you, Bronte. That's wonderful. Yeah. So precautionary principle, important. And also, when I went back to study some of this a little over a decade ago, we learned about, and we all have this experience of, we don't even know anymore. It used to be that this knowledge was passed on generation to generation, right? In storytelling and oral traditions. And we've lost a lot of that. We move around. Who's local? Who can say what it was like? So it's a difficult baseline to really come at. But Bronte is talking about how you can really try to get as close as you can because the key is really to be able to enforce, right? And so, those details are so important. It's a great thing that you brought up. And that's why if you are connected locally and really have that time, that those types of experiences and connections will help in that determination. Do we have another question? Okay.
Am I allowed to quickly talk about it? It's actually it's a real interest of mine, this baseline discussion, because, my river has been significantly changed by humans before America was even founded. It's been going on for so long, we don't even know when the first embankments cut off the tide from the marshes. But that being said, even a question: do you want to go back before pre-human to pre-human state of nature? Because actually, nature has often co-evolved with humans to make something richer. So, for instance, a lot of the time, non-tidal marshes, but still marshes behind a barrier that keep the tide out, can actually be richer than just the tidal marshes. Or where the trees were chopped down to make meadows, those have formed their own intricate ecosystems as grasslands that are actually richer than if we allowed the forest to return. So for me, the question isn't so much about returning to a pre-human idyll. It's about what would be how can we make this part of nature as rich and varied in nature as possible? How do we make this river the most alive it can be? And then balancing the need to have that aliveness with human rights and interests. That for me is the question, not returning to some kind of idealistic past.
Great, Paul, because we are nature too, right? Good. Rose?
I often describe it as becoming a human beaver, because beavers can be seen to damage their environment. They're like chopping down trees and they're like flooding places, but we know that beaver wetlands are incredibly rich and actually beavers are incredible ecosystem engineers that make everything around them richer. So it's not about we can't touch or we can't interact with nature. How do we make that interaction such that we make the natural world around us richer, not poorer?
Hi, I'm Rose Roby. I am the co-chair of the Green Party of Florida. I want to thank Lizzie for all the work she did to create this relationship and introduce this to the Green Party. I'm going to ask two questions. The first one comes from Elizabeth Green, and then I'm going to ask my own question. So, okay, Elizabeth says, thank you for this meeting. As a certified forest steward with a decade of experience in protecting the environment, she's probably the only Green Party member who can represent the last remaining lowland rainforest in the United States. She has repeatedly represented the local trees and wildlife at a local city council meeting. The pro-construction council member could not support his decision to clear cut the public park. How might someone who publishes assist in taking the next step to prevent the unnecessary environmental destruction? And that was from Elizabeth Green.
Thank you so much. Should we jump in and answer that one, and then we can come back to you for your second one? I think we've already proven we can't hold two questions in our heads at once.
Yeah, I was going to do that just that way. That I answer this and then I will ask my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was reading your question in the chat, and I think probably I just need a little bit more information on what you mean by someone who publishes. So, I mean, first of all, I'm just going to guess at it, but I think if you're publishing work about nature protection, then it would really go back to the first part of my speech, which is we have a responsibility to tell a different story. And so one of the things you can do is always advocate for nature representation, nature governance, nature having rights. You can read up about what rights of nature might mean. You can look at different models around the world. You can uplift those stories, and you can start to behave as if nature has rights. I think that's what you mean by someone who publishes. Obviously, if I've got that wrong, feel free to correct me. In terms of your first part of your question around advocacy in your council, I mean, I think the answer would be just keep doing as much of that as you possibly can. Generally speaking, when we look at other movements throughout history. So the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the disability rights movement, the workers' movements. It is decades of representation. So it's decades of union representation, of feminist representation, of representation in all spaces of government, from the smallest council in a village right up to the capital, the parliamentarian systems. So any representation you can provide is excellent, and I think that going into those spaces and explicitly saying you are here to speak for the trees, you're here to speak for the freshwater species, is really, really great. And I think you might feel like it's a really small thing, or you might feel a bit silly. I'm here not to speak for myself, but to speak for the trees. But it does change the room somewhat. I mean, we do it at Faith in Nature a lot. We will, if we're on Zoom, for example, we will actually have a camera sat in a river, in a babbling brook, with birds flying in and out of the shot. And we won't allow that Zoom participant to be muted, for example. So you'll just hear the river flowing through the meeting. And other times we might put it in the forest, depending on what we've been talking about. So I think coming in as nature is incredibly important, and it really does change the tone of the room. Even with sort of the hard line finance people, they're like, oh, the nature is in the room, the trees are being spoken for. So that is a really good thing you can do. Go and educate yourself and get training on things like rights of nature. How do we do it? What does it mean in public space? What does it mean in private spaces? So I'll let Paul jump in. He may want to also answer your question, because he does quite a lot of nature guardianship work at Lawyers for Nature.
You covered most of it, to be honest. Someone's asked if you can stop screen sharing. I don't know if that's yeah, so maybe they would see us, pro.
Oh, and let me jump in here real quick. And because, our first nature related matter in Florida is we have a beautiful forest. It is owned actually by the entire population of the United States. It's the Ocala National Forest. And they are putting in a project which would essentially be a student training airfield right in the middle of the deep woods. It's like the most insane thing ever. Our first action prior to our meeting together was a silent moment for the forest. So we went into the forest and we listened to the forest. Okay. We had that time where we were hearing the forest speak to us, all the living beings and the presence of the forest. And that really helped in our meeting after that. You can imagine what constant takeoff and touchdowns from Cessna airplanes would do to the soundscape in that forest, nonetheless, destroying the trees, all those living, communities, the water. It's an industrial project. So that's how we've begun, and that's how we're going to continue. So thank you for sharing that. Your second question, Rose?
Yes, this one's from me. So, I'm trying to think of how to best phrase this, but I'll try to keep it simple. Given the role of things like land theft and colonization on the environment, on nature, what is the relationship of Lawyers for Nature to indigenous communities who have traditionally had a far more advanced relationship to nature?
I'm happy to jump in there. It's quite interesting, and this is maybe an interesting cultural divide that I guess exists between over the pond between us, which is that we don't have an indigenous population in the UK, which obviously is a big influence on your politics and the way you relate to nature and rights of nature in the US. In some ways, that has made it almost more important to go and listen to indigenous people. And And so I've been on various trips to go and to meet rights of nature promulgating Indigenous peoples around the world. And the strong message has come back that actually the best thing we can do is to take up care and active care for the nature in our own lands. Also very fascinating, I always tell a little story about, I went to meet a tribe called the Sinangue in Ecuador, and they were successful in bringing a rights of nature legal case against the Ecuadorian government to save their ancestral lands and their river. But actually, they didn't really want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about their indigenous guard force, because they found that even once they'd won the legal case, that although that stopped the government mining their river, then illegal miners came in and started doing it without the government's blessing, and the government didn't stop anything. So they set up an indigenous guard force to stop this happening. And I spoke to one member of this guard force who was particularly, into it. And I only found out on the last day that he actually wasn't, a genetic member of the tribe. He'd married into the tribe, and he was born in a normal city on the coast of Ecuador and had moved, I think 5 years before, into the tribe. And he was able to effectively come into that indigenous guard force. It's not that it was somehow in their genes. It was in their connection to nature, was the guardianship that they were doing. And so I've taken that back to the UK and actually said, what we need in a place where we don't have an indigenous presence, we need nature guardians. We need people who spend time with and connect with their local nature and then fiercely fight to protect and to restore it. And to me, that's what the message of indigenous peoples around the world has been to us, is that we need people in that relationship everywhere, because without having people who are in that relationship to nature, nature will be damaged and destroyed.
Thank you.
We're going a little over time, but let's see if there's another question or two. Any more in the room? Yes. Yeah. Oh, here comes.
I was thinking about this because you mentioned earlier about disability, and I know that that there's been a big, huge, I guess, how do I put it? Because like there's a lot of disabled people that do need to use things like straws, and I know you mentioned how somewhere about how it's not good to gatekeep, but at the same time, I know that how do we create education in ways of on how do I put it? Basically, I guess some of my thoughts have been that cities, because obviously it's us, like when we use something and we throw it out or create things to reuse them, if you know what I'm saying. How do we I kind of personally believe that cities, when you do have to throw your trash out that you don't need, shouldn't just dump things into landfills, if you know what I'm saying, where it can just hurt, but things should be captured so they can actually be recycled, if you know where I'm coming from. Because I know that there's some people will tell someone that they shouldn't have a straw, but yet, unfortunately, how do we, look at the balance of that, if you know where I'm coming from?
So the balance point is really, it's an important one. And it's something that Lawyers for Nature are really pushing at the moment, because in the United Kingdom, there's lots of people who are pushing sort of declarations of the rights of nature. Nature has this right, that right, the right to be free of pollution, rivers have the right to flow. But the problem is that, we are in a situation where humans and nature have to be alongside each other. And therefore, what we actually need is a way to balance the genuine needs and interests of human beings with the needs and interests of nature. And that is a case by case basis. And obviously, all production of packaging and things like that is going to have an impact on nature. And if it's completely superfluous, then of course we should be stopping it, because actually producing loads of crap that we dump into nature is bad for nature and we don't really need it. However, if there's a genuine use case for disabled people, then of course, then balancing that need of disabled people against the need of nature, we'll come up with a different result. Or there might be a way, for instance, we can find to actually say, maybe we can recycle these straws. And it's the same with rivers. Saying rivers have the right to flow, we can't remove all flood defences or dams in the UK. It can't happen. It's not going to happen. So it's about saying, well, what dams and flood defences do we actually need? Are there some we don't need anymore? Or are there some which we do need in some ways, but we can make less harmful for nature by changing them? And it's like this over and over again. That is every single right, every single issue. We need to think carefully about how we balance those needs and interests. And obviously, the needs of disabled people is going to be a big one that will need to be balanced against them.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for coming to us. I'm sure it's hard to be in that room instead of you're usually coming to us on the river roading. I know it's a big sacrifice.
I actually was, I'm at a conference today where we're talking about the rights of the River Medway, which is another river in England. So I wasn't sure. I was going to go out on the river, but I wasn't sure of my phone signal. I didn't want to glitch. So I came into the room to make sure you could actually hear me. But I'm sorry the backdrop is so
Thank you for that. And we have a final question. And now I know there's more. So please use that QR code. Go to Green Party of Florida /info/ voice_of_nature. And that's where you'll find that you can join this collective, and we can keep answering each other's questions and helping each other. Last question, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to know how many beavers you've brought on board, because if you have the beavers do it, that'll keep you out of jail.
Well, it's funny. Ironically not, because one of the in the UK, one of the biggest previous environmental nature terrorism was called beaver bombing, which is basically the UK government made it illegal to release beavers into the UK, even though they were native and they were exterminated. And they basically gave you a license, but they only give you a license for your beaver if you put it in basically a cage. Big cage, but still, you had to put it in a cage in case it got out and started beavering at all and doing stuff. It was terrifying. And actually, a group of amazing nature guardians and activists, who I know the names of, but I won't drop them in it, basically became what's called beaver bombers, and they obtained beavers from Europe and then just sort of put them out the back of vans in various rivers in the UK. And then there were so many beavers just living wild, including around the back of a supermarket in a city called Canterbury. Wait a second, there's some beavers here. How did they get here? That the UK government was like, well, I guess they're already here now, so I guess we'll license the release of all these beavers without the cage. But they only did that because these beaver bombers had actually made facts on the ground, I think you could call it, by releasing them. And hopefully one day, not too far away, they might turn their attentions to my river, because we could definitely do with some beavers to do that work for me.
I think we might have to wrap up soon. So I just wanted to say thank you for Lawyers for Nature for allowing us into your space today. And just to finish up on responding to one of those questions, it's never the nature director role is never about being nature police. And I just want to make it really clear that we don't advocate for a position where nature kind of dashes into the room and demands that all disabled people give up their, whatever it might be that they need to have a good life. That's not what we're about. Nature representation is actually quite gentle, and it's very much about bringing everybody along rather than repeating old patterns. So just want to make that super clear. And we would always advocate for a balancing exercise to make sure that's undertaken when other species, whether it's our species or our kin species in other parts of the animal kingdom, when they're at risk, you undertake a balancing exercise, which we're very good at. We do it all the time. But I have to go get it's 5:30 here in the UK, so I have to go get my child any minute now. So I'm going to say goodbye and say thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Bronte and Paul. Thank you, Lawyers for Nature. We
Thank
do
you.
have your QR code also on our handouts there on the table. So you can connect, go to their website, okay? And don't forget to connect with us so we can continue, answering the questions and moving this forward. Thank you kindly, everyone. Thank you for showing up. Bye.